Anyway, it's rolling.
Thank you. Well, what we're going to do is just leave the podium there, and when you do opening, you're just going to have to go over there and address the jury. It's just too strange to move the podium around in the middle of everything. So, is that all right? Can you guys deal with that? Okay. We just have the one podium. Yeah. Do you think that I can steal a podium from another class?
Yeah, she'll talk about it.
You could put that podium on that thing and it rolls.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what I don't want to do, is put a podium around the house. That just makes moving furniture very Yeah. Can we just not use the podium for open disclosure? Is that all right with you guys?
That's great.
Okay. Thanks. No. We're going to take up a couple of preliminary matters before we start what we call to order. My name is Julie Gautreaux. I'm the instructor for this trial practice class. I'll be playing Judge Julie. No, I'm not Judge Julie. I'm Lawyer Julie. Please, if you're on the jury, don't surf the net during the proof. If you're a witness just waiting for your turn to be called, it doesn't matter. Are all the witnesses here? Okay, where's Joe Mitchell? Okay, Joe Mitchell, you will be seated next to your lawyer here at counsel table.
Can I still do my homework?
Well, I'd rather you didn't do your homework during the trial. I mean, is it something that is due tomorrow that you have to get done?
Well, no, but you know, we're here for 3 hours.
Yeah.
I just thought that I was able to.
Well, okay, go
work on
ahead and
it.
do your homework during the proof. That's fine.
What do you say? Did you say you do your homework?
I said you don't need homework. Yeah. Just remember that actually.
Hi, you smell.
Convicted.
You swear.
If you would, maybe during opening statements, just, you know, focus your attention on that, and then during the state's case in chief, work on whatever you want. Okay, so can you tell me who your, State, will you tell me who your witnesses are?
And Sarah Gerard over there is Officer Sliviak.
Okay, hello.
Ari is our Brooke Thompson.
Thank you.
And Will is Quinn.
Okay, thank you guys very much. Do you want your chief investigator to sit at counsel table with you, or are you just going to call her up?
We're just going to call her.
Okay. Okay, defense. I see Joe Mitchell. Who are your other
Then we
witnesses?
have Riley Porter, is Sarah,
Okay.
and Michael Ransom is Christopher, and we're waiting on him to come up. I mean, I'm not sure, I mean, he's in the building.
Okay, so we'll get here
Yeah.
eventually. All right. And we have jurors. Thank you very much. I recognize 2 of them. Thanks for being here. This is what I ask of the jurors. I ask you to stay through the entire trial. It seems sort of intuitive that you would do that, but I've actually had trials in the past with students where people just get up and leave randomly for no reason. And, if you get sick or something, or there's an emergency, you text, I can understand why you would do that, but please try to stay here through the duration, because at the end of the trial, you'll be hearing jury instructions and you will be asked to deliberate for a short period of time and render a verdict. All right, I will now call to order. Again, I would like to thank the jury, the jurors, for being here today. This is the case of State v. Mitchell. I would like to introduce you to counsel at this time. For the state, we have Cameron Kapperman. If you would stand and face the jury, please. And Patrick Morrison. For the defense, Mr. Juan Quevedo and Ms. Kristen Taylor. And the defendant, will rise please, Joe Mitchell. Thank you very much. All right, are there any preliminary matters to take up before we proceed with the proof? right, would the state like to read the indictment?
Case number CR 2126, People of the State of Nita versus Joe Mitchell. The grand jury in and for the county of Darrow, state of Nita, upon their oath and in name and by the authority of the state of Nita, do hereby charge the following offense under the criminal code of the state of Nita. That on September 10th, year 2, at and within the county of Darrow in the state of Nita, Joe Mitchell committed the crime of murder in the first degree in violation of section 18-3-102 of the Nita Criminal Code of year 30 as amended, in that he, after deliberation and with the intent to cause the death of Leslie Mitchell, or the death of another person with a deadly weapon, namely a gun, fired said gun and killed the deceased, contrary to the form of the statute and against the peace and dignity of the people of the state of Nita.
How does the defendant plead? Counsel for the defense?
Not guilty.
Thank you very much. Is the state ready to proceed with opening statement?
Yes, Your Honor. Oh no, Joe. These were Leslie Mitchell's final words. These were the last words she said before the defendant shot and killed her on the night of September 10th, 2012. It was either going to be the defendant's way or the highway. He wouldn't have it any other way. After Leslie didn't get back with the defendant, he refused to accept this and move on. That wasn't how the defendant wanted things to work out. Joe Mitchell didn't get his way. Joe Mitchell got angry. Joe Mitchell deliberately planned out the murder of his wife. Joe Mitchell couldn't get what he wanted, so he shot and killed his wife. It was either the defendant's way or the highway. Members of the jury, let's go back to the night of September 10th, 2012. It's Leslie's birthday. Fortunately, it's the last one she ever had. Leslie was a nice woman with a bright future. She just went to business school. She worked for the bank. But on this night, she just went out to eat with her mother, Bert Thompson. And then she wanted to just go see a movie at the Palace Theater alone. I mean, it's her birthday. And just as she returned home, Ms. Thompson had opened the door. Brakes squealed. Joe Mitchell reaches out the window, the passenger side of the car, shoots his .38 revolver, and kills his wife. The defendant murdered his wife. That man that killed his wife is sitting right there. So ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Joe Mitchell murdered his wife on her birthday. And so tonight you're going to hear from several witnesses to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that she did do it. So today you're going to hear from Ms. Brooke Thompson herself. Ms. Brooke Thompson saw it happen. Ms. Brooke Thompson saw him. He had the motive to murder his estranged wife. He had made threats to both Leslie and her mother many of times throughout the past. The defendant picked up his gun conveniently on that night. Just a few minutes before, he drove by and shot her. And so ladies and gentlemen, you're also going to hear, I'm sorry, I just missed my place. First, you're going to hear from Ms. Brooke Thompson, like I said. And Ms. Thompson's going to talk about how she loved her daughter. She was her only child. Granted, it was a child by her husband, but she raised that girl. If she was her own, she loved with every fiber in her being. She loved Leslie, but now she has no daughter. She lost her daughter to this man. Ms. Thompson will also testify that she could clearly see the defendant that night. She's familiar with his car. She knows his face. He's been over there many times before. Ms. Thompson will also testify that on September 9th, just the night before the murder, that the defendant came over to Ms. Thompson's house. She let him over there. She let him come in. And she just begged him. He was begging Leslie to get back with him. Leslie refused unless he got a real job, because he was just a writer. She'll testify that the defendant, again, made threats to both Leslie and Ms. Thompson on that night. But again, these weren't the first times that he made these threats. And on September 10th, he acted upon these threats. Ms. Thompson knows this man. She's known him for over 4 years. She knows what his face looks like. She knows what his car looks like. And on the night of September 10th, She saw his face, she saw his car, she saw him kill her daughter. So listen to the conviction in her voice tonight. She is a grieving mother. She lost her daughter, and it's still hard to this day for her to deal with this loss. She saw her daughter killed right in front of her as she opened to welcome her home on her birthday. Out of all days, it's the last birthday that she enjoyed with her daughter. Quinn Washington's also going to testify today. Quinn knows the defendant very well. Quinn knows the defendant and Leslie very well because they went to school together. Quinn and Leslie, that is. Quinn met the defendant at the movies one night when Leslie brought him by. Quinn knew that Leslie and the defendant were having marriage problems and that the defendant responded pretty angrily, which is pretty typical. Quinn knew that the defendant had made threats for Miss Thompson and Leslie both. And on the night of Leslie's murder, Quinn was working in the movie theater. She worked at Palace Theater, where Leslie went to see a movie that night. But not only did she see Leslie that night, she also saw the defendant himself after he followed Leslie to the theater, just insisting on where she would be and when she would get out. The defendant insisted on letting Quinn tell him when the movie was going to be over, because again, he had a plan. He knew what he was going to do at the end of that night. Quinn also could tell that night, and Quinn will also testify that he could tell that Leslie was terrified. She was scared of what Joe could do. She asked if Joe even had a gun that night with him. You're also going to hear from Officer Pat Sliviak. Officer Sliviak's a very experienced police officer here in Nita City and has experience throughout the years, many of years. Officer Sliviak will testify to the window of opportunity that Joe had that night and how the defendant had a 50-minute window to do anything, and how typically going from the gun store to his house should only take about a 10-minute drive, but 50 minutes is a big window that the defense is not going to be able to account for tonight. Sliviak investigated the scene that night. He took pictures. He got the bullet. He ended up getting the gun later that night, and he can testify about the orientation of the body itself at the scene of the crime. He will also testify about paraffin tests, and you might not be familiar with these, but this is the gunpowder residue on your hands. She will testify how easy it is to falsify these tests, how easy it is to just clean your hands or do something else to get rid of how these tests are pretty often inconclusive. And also how easy one can clean a gun if you're masterfully, you're very proficient with the gun itself. You recognize the gun, you own the gun, which in this case is a .38 revolver that Joe killed his wife with. So the defense tonight may testify to a few things that I'm going to acknowledge here right now. The defense may offer that the defendant actively listened to a radio show, and that he was doing it that night on September 10th. The defense may also offer that the defendant was listening to the radio or reading magazines that night. But Officer Sliviak will testify that none of these were present when she showed up to his house that night. Just take that into consideration. The state also acknowledges, like I said earlier, that the paraffin test, the gun residue test, came back inconclusive. We recognize that. We don't dispute that. But Officer Sliviak, an officer with many years of experience, knows how easy it is to just falsify these tests, how easy it is to just clean your gun within a matter of a minute if you're extremely familiar with the gun. And again, we'll address that as well. And sure, it was raining this night. We are not going to contest that. But Miss Thompson will again testify that she knows what she saw. She saw the defendant shoot her daughter right in front of her. She knows his face and she knows his car. Eyewitness testimony right there to who killed her daughter. Oh no, Joe. These were Leslie's last words before she was killed. Leslie can't be with us here today because she was shot through the chest. So justice must be served. The killer's in this room. So members of the jury, because the defendant, this man, shot and killed the victim in this case, that's why she can't be here. It was either the defendant's way or the highway, and he couldn't have Leslie, so he wasn't okay with that. He got angry, he made a plan, and he murdered his wife. Oh no, Joe. These are the last words that she said. So members of the jury, we truly appreciate your time here today. The justice system truly appreciates your time here today. And so at the end of this case, we're going to come back to you and ask you to do what the evidence compels and justice demands, and that is find the defendant, this man, guilty of first-degree murder for killing of his wife, who's the real victim in this case. Thank you.
May it please the court. Ladies and gentlemen, imagine you were standing at the beginning of a long wooden bridge, and that's above a raging river. A so-called friend is across this bridge and is telling you to cross. This friend says that it's safe to cross the bridge. As you begin to cross, you realize that it's very unsteady, and there are several wooden planks missing in this bridge, and you were forced to jump from plank to plank in order to reach the other side. The scenario I've just described to you is, in essence, the prosecution's case. Instead of having a smooth foundation that will allow you to walk smoothly across this bridge, they're asking you to jump from conclusion to conclusion in order to reach the other side. As you will see, after all the evidence is presented before you, you will realize that the prosecution is simply jumping from one walk conclusion to the next, in an attempt to gloss over the huge holes in their case. As the jury, it's up to you to see these holes and to not make the mistake of crossing this bridge. This case is all about misidentification and a grieving mother who just wants justice for her daughter's death. And that's easy to sympathize with, a grieving mother who just lost her daughter. But justice, ladies and gentlemen, will not be served today if Joe Mitchell, an innocent man, is falsely convicted of this crime. You will hear from the defendant today, tell you about how much he loved his wife and what effect her death has had on him. Joe Mitchell was born and raised in New City. After faithfully serving his country as a Marine, he returned home and met and fell in love with Leslie Thompson. And they were soon married. Throughout the relationship, Leslie's stepmother, Brooke Thompson, formed a wedge between Leslie and Joe, but she never liked Joe from the very beginning. And this wedge eventually drove them apart, and they separated. Admittedly, Joe and Leslie were a perfect couple. They had fights, they had arguments, but what couple is perfect? There is no perfect couple. But despite these ups and downs, Joe never stopped loving his wife and is truly heartbroken over her death. Let's fast forward to the dark and rainy night of September 10, 2012. And ladies and gentlemen, what happens next is truly a tragedy. Leslie Mitchell is brutally shot on her mother's front porch. The bullet went through her chest and she was pronounced dead at the hospital. Brooke Thompson, the only witness to this crime, claims that a man sped up to her house, leaned out of his window, and fired one shot that hit Leslie in the heart, and suddenly sped away. And she claims that this person was Joe Mitchell. She claims that in a matter of seconds, she was able to see clearly, 35 feet away, in the dark and in the rain, and see my client, Leslie Mitchell. But what you won't hear tonight, ladies and gentlemen, is any concrete evidence that connects my client to the murder in question. What you will hear, however, is the lack of forensic evidence in this case. The paraffin test that tests gun residue, inconclusive. The ballistics test that's supposed to match the bullet from Leslie's body to Joe's gun, inconclusive. The skid mark test that's supposed to match the skid marks inside of Thompson's house to Joe's car, inconclusive. The fact remains, ladies and gentlemen, there is no evidence. No matter how easily it would be to get rid of this evidence, there is none that connects my client to this murder. But listen closely how Brooke Thompson describes her feelings toward Joe Mitchell. How she would rather die than see her daughter end up with Joe. In Brooke's mind, Joe is the only person who could commit this crime. But as the jury, it's up to you to decide this case based on the facts and evidence presented before you, and not on your emotions. Because despite Brooke's conviction that Joe committed this crime, Officer Sidney will testify that Joe Mitchell was not the only murder suspect in this case. Ladies and gentlemen, Joe Mitchell could not have committed this crime. Because there's one thing in this life that is absolute, is that one man cannot be in two places at the same time. Joe Mitchell was nowhere near 1751 Madison Street when the murder occurred. You will hear testimony from several witnesses tonight who saw Joe before, during, and after the murder. In particular, pay close attention to the testimony by Riley Porter and how she described where her room is in relation to the defendants, and how she knew exactly what time he got home that night. You also hear testimony about the weather that night and how it proved to be less than ideal. And by less than ideal, I mean that visibility was limited, it was dark, it was raining, and there was no moonlight. You will hear from Kristen, the person who saw Joe moments before his murder occurred. The state's star witness tonight is Brooke Thompson, a woman who values money and stability over everything. And these are things that she felt Joe cannot provide for her daughter. And I say I say that Brooke is Leslie's stepdaughter because despite Brooke's love and care for Leslie, Brooke never formally adopted her. Brooke would tell you that she supported Leslie, that she raised her, sent her to a private boarding school and a business school. Brooke invested her time, energy, and money into Leslie, and the thought that she would waste her time with someone like Joe Mitchell simply infuriated Brooke Thompson to no end, which would explain why she would blame him for her death. Members of the jury have ended this trial once all the evidence has been presented before you. We will ask you to return the only verdict that the evidence will support, which is a verdict of not guilty. But as I said, one man simply can't be in two places at the same time. Remember, ladies and gentlemen, it is up to the prosecution to prove this case to you beyond a reasonable doubt that Joe Mitchell shot Leslie Mitchell on the night of September 10, 2012. This means, ladies and gentlemen, that there can be no doubt in your mind that Joe committed this crime. And if there is, the only just verdict you can return is a verdict of not guilty. Thank you.
Thank you.
Just to let you know, we will be taking a break at the close of state's proof after they put on their 3 witnesses.
State, call your first witness.
Your Honor, the state would like to call Ms. Brooke Thompson. Please stand.
The witness has been previously sworn.
Would you please state your full name for the record?
My name is Brooke Thompson.
Thank you, Ms. Thompson. Well, I know I'm not supposed to ask this question, but would you mind please sharing your age with the court?
I'm 49 years young.
Are you married?
No, unfortunately, I'm widowed.
I'm sorry to hear that, Ms. Thompson. And so if you don't mind me asking, what did your husband do for a living?
He was a judge.
Okay, now what about children?
Well, we never had children of our own, but I've always considered Leslie to be my own daughter.
Okay. Because that was your husband's daughter?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Your Honor, may we have this marked as Exhibit 1 for identification? Let the record reflect that I'm showing ours been marked as Exhibit 1 for identification to opposing counsel. May I approach the witness?
Yes,
Ms. Thompson, I am showing what's been marked as Exhibit 1 for identification to you. Could you just explain to the court what this is?
That is my deceased daughter laying in front of my house.
Okay, great. Thank you. Your Honor, we now offer Exhibit 1 into evidence. May we pass Exhibit 1 to the jury?
that will be state's exhibit number 1, and you may pass it.
Now, Ms. Thompson, I know that's still hard to see. I know it's hard to see your daughter like that. So how was your relationship with your daughter?
Gosh, it's nothing short of wonderful. She was my everything. I've always raised her like she was my own daughter. I've never considered her to be anything other than that.
So did you love Leslie?
Absolutely, every day.
Did you miss her?
I will never stop missing her.
Sounds like a very loving relationship with your daughter. And so, could you just please tell us where you live in Nita City and how long you've lived there?
I live at 1751 Madison Street, and I've lived there ever since I married Henry.
Okay. And so who lives there with you?
Leslie lived there with me, but nobody now.
And do you own the house?
I do.
And do you own any other property in Nita City?
I do. I own a few apartment complexes.
So you're a landlord too?
I am.
Okay, great. Thank you, Ms. Thompson. So I'd like to take some time to talk about the night of September 10th, 2012. Was there anything special about this day?
That was Leslie's birthday.
And did you do anything special to celebrate your daughter's birthday?
Well, I took her out to dinner, and I gave her a nice little gift, and she wanted something really small and quaint, so we didn't do anything really big.
Okay. But did you stay with her the entire night?
No, I did not. She wanted to go to a movie to clear her mind, so she went to a movie and I stayed home.
Okay. And so when Leslie left to watch the movie, did she specify what time she would be home?
Well, she went to the movie around 7 and she said she'd be home around 10, so.
Okay. And did you have any other visitors that night on September 10th?
I did, yes.
Okay. Who came to visit you?
Joe Mitchell came by looking for Leslie.
Okay. And how did the defendant get to your house?
He drove with that old white Pontiac he has.
Okay. So are you familiar with this car?
Yes,
Okay. Have you seen it before?
multiple times.
Okay. So are you confident that you could recognize this car?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay. And so thank you for that. Back to the night of September 10th. So what did the defendant want that night?
He showed up and, gosh, it was so strange. He didn't have a jacket or umbrella, or he had a jacket and an umbrella or hat or anything. It was pouring and he just wanted to see Leslie.
Okay. And so did you tell the defendant when you expected Leslie to be home?
Yeah, I told him that she'd be back around 10. So.
Okay. And what was the defendant like when he visited your home that night?
He was really nervous and agitated, and he was just kind of pushy and kind of threatening, and I was just really quick to get him out of the way, out of my house.
And how long was the defendant at your house?
Probably like 10 minutes, 5 or 10 minutes.
And so after he left, what did you do?
Well, I closed the door and I went upstairs to turn off Leslie's light because I saw she had left it on. And when I went upstairs, I saw she had left her house key sitting on her dresser, so I decided I'd stay up and wait for her because I didn't know how she was going to get back in.
Okay, great. Thank you, Ms. Thompson. And so let's go back just to right before the shooting. What time did Leslie arrive home?
Right at 10.
Okay. And did she just let herself in?
No, she had left her key, so I let her in.
Okay. All right, and so where was Leslie standing?
Well, the way my porch is set up, there's a step right below the door, and she was standing down before the step, and I was standing above it, so I could just see right over her head.
Okay, and so what were the conditions like at this time?
It was drizzling on and off. It was kind of dark out. It'd been gross all night.
Okay. But could you see past the porch?
Yeah, definitely.
And so as you opened the door to Leslie in, what happened?
Well, as I opened the door to Leslie, and Leslie was starting to let down her umbrella, then out of nowhere, this white Pontiac starts driving up, and Leslie turned around and said, "Oh no, Joe." And right at that time, Joe Mitchell stuck his head out of the passenger side of his car, shot Leslie, and drove away.
Okay, Ms. Thompson, then this next question will be very important. Could you recognize the man that leaned out of the car and shot your daughter?
Absolutely.
Are you confident that it was the defendant?
I'm 110% positive.
Did you see his face?
Yes.
Okay. And do you know his car?
Yes.
Has it been to your house before?
Multiple times. And he always parks right in front of my curb, so I'm used to seeing him right there.
Okay, great. Thank you. So without a doubt, you believe the man to be the defendant.
Absolutely.
Do you see the man that shot your daughter in the room?
I do.
Could you please point to that man?
He's sitting right there.
May the record reflect that Ms. Thompson pointed to the defendant.
So reflective.
Was your vision impaired that night by any way?
No, not at all.
Could you see clearly to the street?
Yes.
Were there any street lights in the area where the car was located?
Well, there's not a street light directly in front of my house, but there's one on the other side of the road, and that had illuminated the whole road. And I have 2 big porch lights right next to my front door, so between all that lighting, it was very easy to see.
So you could still see the defendant?
Yes.
Great. And so how far away is your front door from the street?
About 35 feet.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Thompson. So after Leslie was shot, did the car stay around at all?
No, it drove away just as fast as it had pulled up.
Okay. Did anyone else see the shooting as it unfolded?
No, just me.
Okay. And did anyone else see you and Leslie on the front porch?
No.
So what happened when the police arrived?
I was beside myself, and my neighbor had heard the gunshot, and so she came out and she took me inside, and when the police got there, they had asked me what had happened, and I told them that Joe had shot Leslie.
Objection?
Could you stand up, please, and call your objection?
Objection, hearsay?
Could you restate your answer, please?
I told the police officer that Joe had shot Leslie.
I don't think that falls under hearsay, somehow.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Thompson. Did you have a funeral for your daughter?
I did.
I'm sure that was really tough to bury your daughter, especially since you love her so much. So after the funeral, did you find anything in Leslie's room?
I was going through things, it was so sad, and I remembered I had seen a letter on her nightstand next to the key, and that night I didn't think anything of it. And so I went back to look for the letter, and sure enough, it was a letter from Joe Mitchell.
Your Honor, may we have this marked as Exhibit 2 for identification?
Yes, I'll be marked as it.
Let the record reflect that I'm showing what has been marked as Exhibit 2 to the opposing counsel. May I approach the witness?
Yes,
Ms. Thompson, I'm showing what's been labeled as Exhibit 2. Do you know what this is?
Yes, that's the letter that I found.
Okay, and are you familiar with the handwriting?
Yes, I've seen Joe's handwriting in our guest book. I've seen the letters he's written Leslie. I know that's his handwriting.
Okay, so you are very familiar with Joe's handwriting?
Positive, yes.
And you've seen it before?
Yes.
Okay. And what did the letter say?
The letter said that it was just really threatening, and it said that to Leslie that he was going to make both of us regret what we had done to him, whether it was the last thing that we did.
Objection. I would ask if they're going to read part of the letter to read the entire letter in evidence, not just parts.
I think that the proper protocol is to have the witness.
Okay. Could you please read the letter in its entirety?
Leslie, after what went on tonight at your stepmother's, I guess we're finished. Life is intolerable without you, and I'm going crazy at the thought of this. You let your mind be poisoned against me. You never gave me a real chance. That evil old woman is to blame for all of this. If it hadn't been for her, you wouldn't have walked out on me as you did. She broke up our marriage, and believe me, I hate her for what she's done to us. You hurt me more than I can bear by taking her side against me. It would have been better for me if I had never met either of you. I'm going to make both of you regret what you did to me, if it's the last thing I do. I tried writing tonight, but I can't get you off my mind. I won't give you up as easily as you ran out on me. I suppose I ought to say I don't love you anymore, but I do. From all you said and did tonight, especially your total agreement with your stepmother, it looks like we're finished. But remember, you're still my wife and always will be. Nobody will take you away from me, not your stepmother or anyone else.
Thank you, Ms. Thompson. Your Honor, we now offer Exhibit 2 into evidence. Your Honor, may we pass Exhibit 2 to the jury?
Is there any objection from the defense? All right, that will be exhibit number 2, and you may pass it to the jury.
Thank you, Your Honor. Now, Ms. Thompson, I'm going to ask you a very direct question. Would you ever harm or wish harm on your daughter?
No, absolutely not.
Okay. Fine, Ms. Thompson, I just wanted to clear the air there. But I'd like to talk to you a little bit about your relationship with the defendant in particular. When did you first meet the defendant?
I guess when Leslie and him were dating, she brought him home one time and I met him.
Okay. And so what do you know what he does for a living?
He's a writer, I think.
Okay. And do you think he's been successful as a writer?
I've never heard of him being published at all, so I wouldn't say so.
And do you happen to know where he lives?
I believe he lives at 800 Fillmore Street.
So, Ms. Thompson, did you approve of his relationship with your daughter?
No, I definitely did not. He was not the man for my daughter. He did nothing but bring her down.
Great, thank you. Would your dislike cause you to lie about seeing him on September 10th?
Absolutely not. Just because I dislike somebody doesn't mean I would lie like that.
Did you tell Leslie your opinion of the relationship?
Leslie was well aware of my opinion, yes.
Thank you. So after Leslie and Joe were married, I assume she moved out.
Yes.
And so can you tell us a little bit about the marriage?
Well, I didn't see them at first for a while, for a few months, and I'm sure it was a good marriage. And then after that, she started coming over without Joe, and she was just unhappy all the time. You know, she thought that Joe wasn't contributing anything to the marriage and wanted him to get a real job.
And so did you ever see Joe after the separation?
I did.
And so how often would he come over to your house?
He would come over about 3 or 4 times a week trying to get Leslie to get back together with him.
And what was he like during these visits?
He was always so angry and so threatening, and it was terrifying. I would never let Leslie even in the room alone with him.
And so how did that make you feel as her mother?
It was so scary to know that my daughter was still married to someone like this.
And so did you listen to Leslie's conversations with the defendant?
Yes, everyone. I would never let her be alone with him.
And so did you ever have interactions with the defendant himself when he would come over?
I did, not very pleasant ones.
Okay, so what sort of things would he say to you?
He just always called me an evil old witch and told me that it was my fault that their marriage had ended and blamed everything on me and threatened me and said it was the last thing he was going to do to get back at me for ruining their marriage.
So how did that make you feel, Ms. Thompson?
Terrified, obviously.
And so did the defendant visit your house the night before the murder on September 9th?
He did, yes.
Okay. And did What was the subject of the conversation during that visit?
It was, I guess, one last ditch attempt to get Leslie to get back together with him.
And did Joe make any threats on that evening?
Yes, he got really angry that Leslie said, you know, stop writing and find a job or the marriage is over, and he just couldn't handle that. And he told her that she was going to regret that if it's the last thing she ever did.
So, Ms. Thompson, would you say that you know the defendant fairly well?
Yes.
And since you know him, did the defendant ever mention to you that he owned a gun?
Yeah, he used to brag about being such a good shot with a gun, something about hitting a dime at 100 yards.
Okay. Now, Ms. Thompson, I know this has to be hard even these years later, but do you love your daughter?
Gosh, I will never stop loving my daughter.
And do you miss your daughter?
Every single day.
And so, just to make sure we're all clear on this, on the night of your daughter's murder, what were her final words?
Oh no, Joe.
Thank you, Ms. Thompson. No further questions, Your Honor.
Cross-examination.
Hello, Ms. Thompson. Thank you for being here today. I'm very sorry for your loss as well. Let's begin about talking about that night, that fateful September 9th. You said that Leslie was shot at around 10 p.m. when she came home. And was it dark at 10 p.m.?
It was dark, yes, it was nighttime.
And it was raining as well that night?
It was drizzling when she came home. It had been raining off and on all day, but it wasn't pouring when she got there.
But it was raining though?
It was drizzling, yes.
Okay. When the shooting occurred, there were no really nearby streetlights. The nearest streetlight was 30 feet away.
Well, yeah, but it's standard for a neighborhood. I mean, anybody who lives in a neighborhood knows that one street light can light up a whole corner.
And also there was lighting from the headlights of the car.
And from my porch, yes.
Okay. I was about to say, your porch lights were on that night,
Yes.
right? And Ms. Thompson, you've lived at 1751 Madison Street for several years now.
Yes.
Right? And you're quite familiar with the home.
Mhm.
Your Honor, may we have this marked for Defense Exhibit 1 for identification? I'll let the record reflect I'm showing this to opposing counsel. May I approach the witness? Ms. Thompson, can you identify this photo?
Yes, that's my house.
Okay, and this is very accurate representation?
Yes.
May I approach the document camera? Well, I'm sorry. We now are on this, offer this exhibit into evidence. It's Defense Exhibit 1 into evidence.
No objection.
Okay. So on this night, you said your porch lights were on, correct? Okay.
And so were all of the lights and all of the windows on the bottom floor.
Here, here, and here. Is that accurate?
Yes, and the front door was open, so the light was coming out of there as well.
There was some light, okay. Like you said, the lights were on in the living room, so there was light from there, and the lights were on, so the lights helped illuminate the porch.
Yes,
But the man who killed Leslie, the shot came from 35 feet away on the street.
yes.
Correct. And it was still raining and it was still dark that night when the shot occurred. And this all happened in a matter of seconds.
Correct.
Right. So through the lights on the porch would really illuminate the porch, and so there would be kind of sort of a glare.
Well, no, the lights, I mean, my front yard isn't too long. It's like, I don't know, 30 feet long. And it went a good distance into my front yard.
And your first thought was that the man who shot your daughter was Joe Mitchell.
I know it was Joe Mitchell. It's not a thought.
And like you say, you didn't like Joe Mitchell, did you, Ms. Thompson?
I never really approved of his relationship with Leslie, no.
In fact, you never even liked him the first time that you met him. You instantly just...
I never thought
never-
he was right for Leslie. As a mother, I just get feelings, and I never felt like he was the right man for Leslie.
And you definitely didn't want him to marry your daughter.
I didn't approve of that, but I wouldn't say that I was completely opposed to it.
But you disliked it so much, you didn't attend their wedding.
I was ill.
You were ill that
I
day?
was.
You thought that he wasn't good enough for your daughter.
I did not think he was good enough for my daughter, no.
You thought that he was lazy and just wanted her money.
Yes.
You didn't think he could support her financially.
I think if he were to get a real job, he could have supported her, but he wouldn't he wouldn't leave his writing for Leslie, and any man who's not gonna leave something for their wife doesn't deserve to be with her.
But despite all your dislike and somewhat hatred for the defendant, your daughter still married him anyway.
Yes, she loved him.
Your hatred runs pretty deep of Joe.
I wouldn't say that I disapproved of him.
You disapproved of him dating your daughter.
Yes,
You didn't like him as a person.
I wouldn't say that.
You just didn't like him with your daughter.
I did like him with my daughter, correct?
Miss Thompson, you stated earlier that you loved your stepdaughter, right?
Absolutely.
And you would do anything to protect her from harm's way, keep out of harm's way.
For anything.
And protect her. And the night before Leslie was killed, you witnessed her and Joe's last argument.
Yes.
That night. After Mr. Mitchell left, you were maybe a little nervous, a little afraid of him that night.
Terrified.
But that following evening of September 10th, Mr. Mitchell came to your home again.
He did, yes.
And he was looking for Leslie,
Yes.
right? He wanted to talk to her.
Mm-hmm.
And you told Joe where Leslie was that night.
I did.
And you knew that Leslie was alone.
I did.
So, despite your love and desire to protect Leslie, you told her husband where she was, and she was alone that night, even though you yourself were afraid of him.
Well, granted, alone, she was by herself, but I knew she was at a public place. You can't get more of a public place than a movie theater. There's hundreds of people around. One of her close friends was the ticket person there. If he went to the movie theaters, I wasn't afraid that he was going to come in and do something harm to her. He's not going to do that in a public place.
You wouldn't think he would harm her that night.
Not in a public place, no.
Oh, so even a private place.
I told him Leslie was going to the movies because I did not think that he would do anything drastic while she was around hundreds of people on a night at the movies at
So
7
you
o'clock.
didn't think he would harm her.
Not
Objection.
in public.
Objection, badgering the witness, Your Honor.
I'm simply trying to elicit the answer that I've asked.
Well, this is cross-examination. You're pushing a little hard at this point, but it's not a good line.
Thank you, Ms. Thompson. No further questions.
Any redirect?
Yes, Your Honor.
And remember, redirect is limited to one question.
One question. Ms. Thompson, thanks again for being here tonight. On the night of September 10th, who did you see pull up in front of your house?
I saw Joe Mitchell pull up in front of my house and shoot my daughter, and that image is going to be scarred into my brain for the rest of my life.
Thank you, Ms. Thompson. No further questions, Your Honor.
State, call your next witness.
State would like to call Quinn Washington to the stand, please.
Sorry, I forgot to excuse the witness. May this witness be excused from the trial.
She may. Can we have that clear?
Yeah, I was gonna pass that to the jury. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
We're on a holding pattern right now.
Kristen.
Could you please state your full name for the record, please?
Quinn Washington.
Okay, Ms. Washington, do you live in Nita City?
Yes, I do.
And where do you live at?
50 King Street.
And do you have a job?
I do.
And where do you work?
The Palace Theater.
Now, Ms. Washington, did you know the victim, Leslie Mitchell?
Yes, very well.
And how long have you known Leslie?
We've been good friends since grade school.
And what was the nature of your relationship?
We spent a lot of the time at each other's houses. I knew her mother quite well.
Okay, good. Now, did you know the defendant, Joe Mitchell?
Yes.
And when did you meet Mr. Mitchell?
In the winter of 2011.
Okay. Now, did you know that Joe Mitchell and Leslie Mitchell were in a relationship?
I did, yes.
And did you approve of that relationship?
Well, I wasn't very familiar with the relationship, but I do know that Mrs. Thompson did not approve of their relationship at all.
Okay. Well, did you know Leslie's mother, Brooke?
I did.
And Did she approve of that relationship?
Mrs. Thompson, as far as I know, did not really approve of their relationship. She was very caring of Leslie and always had her best interests in mind, and I don't think that she had Joe in mind for her best interests.
Very good. Well, did you attend Leslie and Joe's wedding?
I did.
Okay. Now, did you see Leslie in August of 2012?
Yes.
And did y'all interact?
Yes, she came to the movie theater.
And so what did y'all talk about that night?
She told me about Joe and her recent separation, and
Okay. Well, did she say anything that made you concerned for her well-being at this time?
Objection, Your Honor. We believe the prosecution is about to solicit hearsay.
8033 allows us to ask about then existing mental conditions regarding opposing party statements.
Let me listen to more on the objection.
Okay.
Can you
Well,
restate the question?
did she say anything on that night in August 2012 that made you concerned for her well-being?
yes, she was scared the night before Joe had come to her home where she was
At
staying.
this point, I want to admonish the witness that you can you approach the bench, please? I take this up outside the hearing of the jury.
Okay, well, how was her demeanor on that night in August 2012?
She seemed scared and threatened, nervous.
Okay, now was this the last time that you saw her?
No, it wasn't.
Okay, so when was the last time that you saw her?
Unfortunately, the day that she died.
And where did you see her?
At the movie theater again.
And what time did she arrive at the theater?
She came around at 7 o'clock.
And was she alone at this time?
Yes.
And how was her demeanor at this time?
Again, she was frightened, very nervous.
Objection, speculation to how the witness was. She won't know what she felt.
No, I'm not gonna overrule that. I think the witness is testifying based on her personal observations that night.
So how was Leslie's demeanor that night?
She seemed very frightened and nervous. She kept looking up and down the street as if she was looking for someone.
Okay. And so were you concerned for her well-being at this point?
I was, very much so.
So what did Leslie do next that night?
Well, she bought a ticket, and she went into the movie theater.
And did you see the defendant this night as well?
I did.
And where did you see him?
He came to the movie theater
And around what time did you see him there?
around 7:30, 7:45.
And did you interact with him that night?
I did, yes.
And what was the subject of that conversation?
Well, we spoke about Leslie.
Okay, was he there to see Leslie?
He was, yeah. He asked if I had seen her, if I knew where she was, and I told him that she was in the theater.
And how did you feel about that?
I didn't like him being there. Again, I was scared for her. I saw her, the way that she was acting earlier, and I asked him what he did to Leslie, and I asked him to leave her alone.
And what was Joe Mitchell's response to that?
Well, he said that he loved his wife, but he said that Leslie and her mother would also be sorry for what they did to him.
And how was Joe's demeanor during this exchange?
He seemed very angry and nervous, maybe anxious.
So did Joe actually go into the theater to see Leslie?
Yes. Well, actually, I don't know for sure. He bought a ticket at 7:45, and that was the last I saw of him until around 8:30, 8:45.
Okay. And did you talk to him again before he left?
I did. Before he left, he asked me again when Leslie's movie would get out.
And did you tell him what time Leslie's show would end that night?
Yes, I said around 9:40.
And did you think it was odd that he wanted to know that?
Well, not at the time, but in hindsight, I wish I had never told him.
Okay. Now, can you recall what the defendant was wearing that night?
Yes, it was a wet, dark jacket.
Thank you. Now, when Leslie came out of the theater, did you talk to her again that night?
Yes, I did.
Did you tell her that Joe had been to the theater?
Yes, I did.
And what was her reaction to that news?
She was really scared. She was frightened. And she asked if Joe had a gun with him.
Did that seem like a strange question for her to ask?
Yeah, it seemed a little odd. But I told her I didn't see a gun.
Very good. Now, what time did Leslie leave that night?
Around 9:45.
And how did she leave the Palace Theater?
She walked home.
Okay. And do you know how far of a walk it was to Mrs. Thompson's house where she was staying?
About 5 blocks.
So were you scared for Leslie that night after she left?
Yes, very much so.
Okay. Did you communicate that to her?
Yes, I told her that I would call the police for her, which she didn't want me to do. I also told her that she could stay in the booth with me until my shift was over if she was too scared to walk home. But unfortunately, she didn't. She went straight home, and that was the last time I saw my friend.
Thank you. No further questions.
Cross-examination.
Ms. Washington, you weren't subpoenaed to come to court today, were you?
No,
So you came voluntarily, right?
I did. For Leslie.
And you first met Joe about 3 years ago, correct?
Yes.
And Leslie introduced you to him like any girlfriend would, didn't he?
Yes.
And like any couple in love, they came to the theater often, right?
I wouldn't say often, but yes, I suppose.
And the year that you met Joe, you learned that Leslie and Joe were going to get married.
Yes.
And they were married on November 2011, is that right?
Yes,
And you attended their weddings, didn't you?
I did.
But Ms. Thompson didn't attend, did she?
No, she was sick.
Right. And she also didn't attend because she didn't like Joe, didn't she?
Objection, Your Honor. Lack of personal knowledge.
I think that, I'm going to sustain the objection because I think you need to lay more of a foundation for the question.
Ms. Washington, on direct, you testified that Ms. Thompson does not like Joe. Is that still your testimony?
Well, I said that I thought that Mrs. Thompson had Leslie's best interests in mind, and that I presume that that's why she didn't approve of their marriage. I don't know if she didn't necessarily like him.
And with that said, Leslie and Joe still got married, didn't they?
Yes, I did.
And you were surprised to hear that they were getting separated, or they separated, weren't you?
I suppose.
All right. Ms. Washington, I'm going to ask you questions regarding your friendship with Leslie. You were Leslie's friend, weren't you?
Yes, I was.
And you and Leslie were friends since childhood, is that true?
Yes.
And you went to grade school with Leslie too.
Mm-hmm.
And you were often concerned with Leslie's happenings, weren't you?
Yeah, she was my friend.
So as a friend, you love Leslie, is that true?
Yeah, I would say so.
And you feel that a friend should want to help her friend in any way that she can, is that right?
I suppose.
And you're here today because you want to help, right?
I do.
All right, so you're Leslie's friend. But you don't consider Joe your friend, do you?
We were never close.
And isn't it true that you argued with Joe on the night that Leslie died?
I wouldn't say that I argued with him. I was merely expressing that I was scared for Leslie and I wanted to understand why he was there.
All right. And you know that Mr. Mitchell is charged with murder of your friend tonight, right?
Yes, I understand that.
And he could potentially be sent to prison for the rest of his life.
I'm aware.
Ms. Washington, I'm going to ask you questions regarding what happened after September 10th, 2012. Isn't it true that you saw Leslie the night she died?
Yes.
And you spoke to her, didn't you?
Yes, I did.
And you asked Leslie some questions, is that correct?
Yes.
And Leslie gave you some answers,
Yes.
but you don't remember the exact words she told you, is that right?
I can't say that I recall her exact words.
Right. So you saw and you spoke with Leslie on the night that September 10th, 2012. But you also saw and spoke with Joe that night, right?
Yes, I did.
And you saw Joe about 7:45 that night,
Yes.
and you spoke to him.
Yes, I did.
But you don't remember the exact words that he said either. Is that right?
I can't say that I did.
And so Joe, you saw Joe get to the Palace Theater at 7:45, and Joe left the theater at about between 8:30 to 8:45. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Right. Ms. Washington, I'm going to ask you questions about what happened after that night. After speaking with Leslie and Joe on September 10th, 2012, you didn't speak with anyone else regarding the incidents on that night, did you?
No.
And Leslie died about 2 years ago, is that right?
Yes.
And you were working at the Palace Theater when Leslie died.
Yes, I was.
And you still work at the Palace Theater.
Yes, I do.
So yeah, you have been working at the Palace Theater for the past 2 years since Leslie died, haven't you?
Mm-hmm.
And you talk to more than 100 different customers during the week, don't you?
Yes, I do.
And you cannot possibly remember all the details that these customers tell you.
Of course not.
And you haven't talked to anyone about what happened on September 10th, 2001, have you?
No.
Right. I have no further questions.
Want to redirect a question?
Yes, Mr. Washington, again, could you just clarify the substance of what Joe said when you spoke to him at the theater that night?
Yes. He said that he wanted to see Leslie and he wanted to know where she was. He told me that he loved his wife and that that Leslie and Brooke would be sorry for what they did. And he also described to me jokingly about his shooting ability. He bragged to me about how much of a sharpshooter he was.
Thank you.
May the witness be excused?
Yes.
Thank you. Call your next witness.
state would like to now call Officer Sliviak to the stand. Could you please state your full name for the record?
My name is Pat J. Sliviak.
And what is your occupation?
I'm an officer with the Nita City Police Department.
And how long have you worked there?
Approximately 5 years.
Great, okay. Well, Officer Sliviak, were you called to 1751 Madison Avenue on the night of September 10th, 2012?
I was on routine patrol with my partner and we received the call around 10:10 p.m.
And what did you see when you arrived?
When we arrived, I observed a woman in her mid-20s lying on the front step of the house with her feet pointed toward the door and her head pointed toward the street. Upon closer observation, I discovered a large gunshot wound to her chest with a lot of blood emanating from it.
Okay. Was the victim alive when you arrived?
I checked for a pulse. There was no pulse. There was no signs of breathing.
Thank you, officer. Now, was anybody else present at the scene when you arrived?
Yes, the victim's stepmother, Brooke Thompson.
And what was her demeanor like that night?
She was half hysterical and crying.
Okay. And did you talk to Mrs. Thompson that night?
I did.
And did she tell you who shot her daughter?
Yes, she said that a car pulled up in front of the house and a man leaned out of the window and shot the victim. The man she identified as the victim's estranged husband, Joe Mitchell.
And did Mrs. Thompson seem certain of that identification?
Yes, she was very clear on this.
And again, how was her composure when you were talking to her?
She was visibly upset, but she was composed. I had no reason to doubt the identification.
Okay. Thank you, officer. So, as a veteran police officer, are you familiar with crime scene investigation protocol?
Yes, that is part of my regular duties.
And did you retrieve any evidence from the scene at 1751 Madison Avenue that night?
I did. We recovered a .38 caliber bullet.
Okay, and how did you recognize the caliber?
That is the same type of weapon that I carry.
Thank you. Now, Officer Sliviak, did you take any pictures of the scene that night?
I did.
Your Honor, may I approach the witness?
Okay.
Officers, I'm going to show you what has previously been marked as Exhibit 1 for the state. Could you identify it?
Yes, this is the photograph of the victim that I took as I observed her when I arrived at the scene.
Okay, so you did take this picture?
I did.
Okay. Could you please describe to the court what this picture shows?
It shows the victim, Leslie Mitchell, laying in front of the doorway to the house, her head pointed toward the curb, her feet pointed toward the steps, with blood emanating from a wound in her chest.
Okay, and did you alter the body in any way prior to taking this picture?
I did not.
Okay. And where was Leslie Mitchell's body located when you arrived in relation to the house?
It was directly in front of the door.
Okay. Could you please point out and describe on that picture the exact location where the bullet entered Leslie Mitchell's body?
If you were to look at the photograph and look at me in relation, the bullet entered in this dark spot in the photo, which is the upper portion of her chest near her heart on the left side.
Okay. Now, officer, are you familiar with .38 caliber rounds?
I am. Again, that is the type of weapon that I carry, and I am extremely familiar with those rounds.
Are those rounds powerful?
They are.
Could their momentum cause a body to move?
Yes, especially with what happened here. The description that was given to me was that Leslie was turned at the time that she was shot. If the bullet hit her in the correct way at the time that she was shot, it could have very easily spun her around and caused her to land in this position.
Okay, thank you. Now, Officer Sliviak, Mrs. Thompson told you a man in a car killed her daughter and that he shot from the street. So did you collect any evidence from the street that night?
Yes, we observed skid marks in the street in front of the house.
Your Honor, may we please have this marked as Exhibit 3 for identification? Let the record reflect that I'm showing what's been marked as Exhibit 3 to opposing counsel. Your Honor, may I approach the witness? Officer Sliviak, I am showing you what has been marked as Exhibit 3 for identification. Can you recognize it?
Yes, this is the crime lab report that was performed on the evidence that was collected.
And so are you familiar with crime lab reports?
I am. We do them on a regular basis as part of every homicide investigation.
And can you verify that this, in fact, is an authentic crime lab report?
It is in fact the report that was done. It is authentic and it was the one that was done for this specific case.
Okay, and have you reviewed this particular report in the
I
past?
have.
Okay. Thank you, officer. Now, this report talks about skid marks located on the street directly in front of Mrs. Thompson's house. Did you observe any such skid marks on the night of September 10th?
Yes, I did.
And did you measure those skid marks?
I did.
What were the measurements?
They were approximately 16.35 centimeters in width.
Are those measurements consistent with the size of the tires on the defendant's vehicle?
They are.
And could you tell how fresh those skid marks were?
They could have been made anywhere from that night to approximately 2 weeks prior.
Very good. How far were these skid marks from the location of Leslie Mitchell's body?
They were 35.5 feet from the location of the body.
And how do you know that 35.5 feet was an accurate measurement?
I measured them myself using a 50-foot tape measure that we keep with our vehicle.
Okay. Your Honor, may we please have this marked as Exhibit 4 for identification?
Yes, that'll be exhibit 4.
Okay, let the record reflect I am showing what has been marked as Exhibit 4 to opposing counsel. And may I approach the document cam, please?
Yes, you
Okay. Officer Sliviak, on the screen, you can see what has been marked as Exhibit 4 for identification. Can you identify it?
It appears to be a diagram of the front of Brooke Thompson's house.
Okay, and to the best of your memory, does this image reflect the layout of Mrs. Thompson's house as it appeared on the night of September 10th, 2012?
That is an accurate depiction to the best of my remembering.
Okay. Your Honor, may the witness please leave the box for the purpose of a demonstration?
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to hand you this pen.
Okay.
Yeah, just-
Objection, before this continues, we just like maybe the court to point out that this drawing is not to scale, and the jury should rely on it for its dimensions or authenticity.
Is the state seeking to introduce this into evidence at this time?
This is simply demonstrative. We don't seek to pass this to the jury.
Well, I'm going to allow the witness to testify about it as long as.
Okay. Now, Officer Sliviak, could you please mark on this diagram the location where you found Leslie's body?
Yes, we found Leslie's body in approximately this location.
Okay, and can you also mark with a B where you found the bullet?
Yes. We found the bullet approximately here.
And with an S, could you please identify the locations of the skid marks on the street?
Yes, we located the skid marks at approximately this location.
Okay. Now, could you draw a line between the body and the skid marks and indicate on the map what you measured that distance to be?
Absolutely. We measured the the distance between the body and the skid marks to be, let's see, 35.5 feet.
Thank you, Officer Sliviak. You can return to stand. Was there any sort of obstruction between the skid marks and the location of the victim's body?
There was not. The distance was clear.
Thank you, Officer. So what did you do that night after leaving 1751 Madison?
We proceeded to the defendant's residence at 800 Fillmore Avenue.
And why did you go to the defendant's residence?
We were going there to question the defendant and further our investigation.
Officer Sliviak, as a Nita City Police Department, would you say that you are familiar with the city and the streets?
Absolutely, it's part of my routine patrol.
Okay, Your Honor, may we please have this map marked as Exhibit 5 for identification?
Yes, you may have to exhibit 5.
Let the record reflect that we are showing it to opposing counsel. May I set this up on that chair over there?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Officer Sliviak, I'm showing you what has been marked as Exhibit 5 for identification. Can you identify it?
It appears to be a section of the city of Nita.
Okay. Officer, take a second to look at the map. Would you say that it's accurate?
Yes.
Okay, Your Honor, we now offer Exhibit 5 into evidence and ask that it be passed to the jury.
No objection.
Okay. Well, Officer Sliviak, can you please identify, to the best of your knowledge, the location marked as A on that map?
That is 1751 Madison Avenue, the residence of Brooke Thompson, and the location of the victim.
Okay, and location E, please.
That is 800 Fillmore Avenue. That is the residence of the defendant, Joe Mitchell.
Okay. Now, officer, have you driven past these locations before?
Yes, all of these areas are part of my regular patrol of Nita.
So, how far apart, approximately, are 1751 Madison and 800 Fillmore?
They are roughly 7 to 10 minutes apart.
Is that following all the traffic rules?
Yes, if you're proceeding at a normal speed, you can make it from point A to point E on that map in approximately 7 to 10 minutes.
So, could you get there faster if you drove over the speed limit?
Absolutely.
So, on the night of September 10th, what time did you arrive at 800 Fillmore Avenue?
We arrived between 10:40 and 10:45 p.m.
Okay, and what did you do when you arrived?
Well, the first thing I did was I observed a vehicle on the street, a 2002 white Pontiac. After observing this vehicle, we proceeded to the front door.
Okay. Was the defendant inside the house when you arrived?
He was.
And did you make contact with him?
Yes.
And did you tell him why you were there that night?
We informed him that his wife, Leslie Mitchell, had been shot.
Okay. So what was his reaction to that news?
He got very pale, looked as though he was going to faint, and then asked me if she was dead.
Okay. So did you find the wording of that question funny?
Actually, yes, I did. Most of the time when we inform a family member that there has been some sort of accident or crime, the first reaction is usually, are they all right, and where can I find them? That was not the question in this case.
Okay. Well, did Mr. Mitchell invite you inside that night?
Yes.
And did he tell you what he had been doing that night?
Yes, he said that he had been reading.
Did you go into Mr. Mitchell's room?
We went into the living room of the house, yes.
Okay. Did you observe any reading materials in the room?
I did not observe any books or newspapers anywhere in the room.
Was the radio on in the room?
I do, to the best of my knowledge, it was not, however, I cannot remember for certain.
Okay. And did the bed look like it had been used that night?
No, from where I could see, the bed looked like it was still made.
Okay. And what was the defendant wearing when you arrived?
He was in a bathrobe.
Okay. Well, did you observe anything else in the room that night?
Yes, the room was fairly cluttered, and in a pile on the floor there were a wadded up pile of socks, trousers, and a dark colored jacket.
Okay. What condition were these clothes in?
They were soaking wet.
Great. And was there anything else notable in the room?
Yes, lying next to the dark colored jacket there was a .38 caliber Smith & Wesson revolver.
Okay. Did you retrieve the gun?
I went to retrieve the weapon, and about that time the defendant re-entered the room and jumped in front of me and picked up the gun himself.
Okay. Did you collect that gun as evidence that night?
I did. After he picked up the gun, he looked down at it and then handed it over to me and stated he had nothing to hide.
Okay. Well, were there any tests conducted on the gun that you retrieved from Mr. Mitchell's house?
There were.
Okay. And what did those tests reveal?
That the gun had been recently cleaned and had been recently exposed to water.
Okay. Now, Officer Sliviak, once again, are you familiar with .38 caliber pistols?
I am.
And are you familiar with the procedure for cleaning them?
Absolutely. I do that every time I clean my gun.
Officer Sliviak, how long would it take to clean a gun that had only been fired once?
Less than a minute.
Did the gun look like it had been cleaned recently?
It did.
And did the defendant explain why his gun was just laying on the floor?
No, he did not.
Did you think that was an odd location to leave a gun?
Yes, with something as dangerous as a handgun, I think, it's my opinion that the floor is a very strange place to leave an item like that.
Thank you, officer. Now, on that night, did you take the defendant to the police station?
We did.
And did he come voluntarily?
Yes, he did.
And was he under arrest at this time?
He was not.
Did you arrest him later that night?
He was arrested later that night, yes.
Now, at any time during this night, did Joe ever ask to go see his injured wife?
He did not.
Is that normal behavior for spouses whose significant other have been injured?
No. Normally, when spouses are told that their significant other has been injured, the first thing they want to do is go to the hospital and view either side.
Okay. Well, Officer Sliviak, at the police station, did you gather any evidence from the defendant?
At the police station, we performed a paraffin test.
And was the test conclusive?
The test came back negative.
Okay, officer, are you familiar with paraffin tests?
Yes, they are a regular part of a criminal investigation.
And are paraffin tests generally reliable?
Typically, Technically, no, because there are so many ways that you can beat a paraffin test. You see, what a paraffin test does is it tests for gunshot residue on your hands. There are several ways that you can defeat that by either wearing gloves, washing your hands, using a chemical agent, even things such as tobacco or urine can remove the gunshot residue from your hands.
Great, officer. So while the defendant was at the police station, how was his demeanor?
On the way to the police station, he was very nervous and very agitated. When I went back to the room where he was sitting, he was looking as if he was trying to flee.
And did he ever try to leave that night?
He was on his way out the door. It looked like he was trying to leave the police station, yes.
Okay, was he walking fast?
Yes.
And so what was your impression of his conduct as he was trying to leave?
Very nervous, very agitated.
Okay, and did you arrest the defendant at this point?
He was arrested at that time, yes.
Did you suspect the defendant was guilty of murdering his wife that night?
Originally on that night, no, I did not believe that he had.
Okay, but when you arrested the defendant, were you operating on the best evidence you had at the time?
Yes, at that time, all the evidence did in fact point to the defendant.
Thank you very much, officer. No further questions.
Cross-examination.
Right. Officer Sliviak, I'm going to ask you questions regarding the night of September 10th, 2012. You were on patrol that night, weren't you?
Yes, with my partner, Walter Johnson.
And routine patrol of United City is part of your duties, isn't it?
Yes, that's part of my regular duties as an officer.
And on that day at approximately 10:10 p.m., you responded to a radio call to investigate a shooting at 1751 Madison Street, didn't you?
That is correct.
And when you got there, you found Leslie lying on the floor, didn't you?
Actually, not on the floor. She was on the porch in front of the house.
Thank you. And you took photographs of Leslie, didn't you?
I did.
You also found a bullet shell near Leslie's head, didn't you?
I found it near the body, yes.
Officer Sliviak, after investigating the shooting on 1751 Madison Street, the police station advised you to contact Leslie's husband, Joe Mitchell.
We radioed ahead, and that was the next step in our investigation, yes, was to go to Joe Mitchell's house and ask him questions to further our investigation.
And on direct examination, you testified that to get from 1751 Madison Street to 800 Fillmore, it takes about 7 to 10 minutes. Is that still your testimony?
If one is driving the speed limit, yes.
And on direct examination, you testified that you got to 800 Fillmore between 10:40 and 10:45. Is that still your testimony?
That is correct.
Officer Sliviak, I'm going to ask you questions regarding when you got to 800 Fillmore Street Avenue. When you got there, you spoke to Joe, didn't you?
I did.
And when you spoke to Joe Mitchell, you told him that his wife had been shot, didn't you?
I did.
And when you told him this, you noticed that his face turned pale, didn't it?
Yes, and he looked as if he was about to faint.
And Joe Mitchell was so shaken up to learn that his wife had been shot that you had to help him sit down in a chair, didn't you?
Well, like I said, he turned pale and he looked as though he was about to faint. I don't know if he was shaken up or not, but I did assist him to a chair.
Thank you. And after Joe Mitchell was able to sit down, because you helped him sit down, he asked you whether his wife was still alive. Is that true?
His exact words were, "Is she dead?"
Officer Sliviak, I'm going to ask you questions regarding transporting Joe to headquarters. After you informed Joe that his wife had been shot, you asked him to go to the headquarters, didn't you?
He voluntarily came with us, yes.
So at that point in time, you didn't arrest him, did you?
No, we did not.
And Joe wouldn't voluntarily go to the station with you if he had something to hide, would he?
I have no idea.
And Joe did voluntarily go with him to the
That
station.
is correct.
And at this point, Joe said that he wanted to cooperate with you all the way, didn't he?
He did. He said he wanted to help in any way that he could. He also kept repeating that he had nothing to hide.
Thank you. On direct examination, you testified that once Joe was at the station, he was looking around like he was trying to sneak out. Is that still your testimony?
He was leaving the interview room as if he was trying to leave the station house, yes.
But he didn't sneak out, did he?
We arrested him before he could leave.
But he didn't sneak out, right?
No, because we arrested him before he could leave.
Thank you. But your belief that he was going to sneak out was based on your experience as an officer, is that right?
It was based on his behavior at the time.
And during this time, you were with Detective Bradley, weren't you?
I was.
And you spoke to Detective Bradley, didn't you?
We spoke frequently that night, I'm sure.
And you told Detective Bradley that you didn't think that Joe did it, did you?
At that time, no, I did not believe that he had done it.
Thank you. And it was your officer's senses that made you believe that he didn't do it, right?
I had a gut feeling, but a gut feeling is not the same as the evidence that was laid out in front of us at the time.
And you get this gut feeling because you've been on the streets for 5 years, right?
That is correct.
But you arrested Joe because Bradley was calling the shots by him, right?
Actually, it was Bradley that arrested Joe, and yes, he was the lead detective on the case at that time.
All right. And Officer Sliviak, if you were calling shots, you wouldn't have arrested Joe, would you?
Objection, Your Honor. Calls for speculation.
No, it is a standing objection.
Officer Sliviak, I'm going to ask you questions regarding a man named Jerry Young.
Okay.
After Leslie's shooting, you questioned Jerry Young about his whereabouts on the night of September 10, 2012, didn't you?
Word on the street was that there was this person named Jerry Young.
Officer Sliviak, I'm sorry. I'm gonna ask you to answer my question, please.
I'm attempting to answer your question, sir.
So, on that night, you did question Jerry Young, did you?
I did not question Jerry Young on the night of Leslie Thompson's murder, no.
One moment, Your Honor. Officer Sliviak, do you recall testifying in a case with very similar facts to this one?
I absolutely do.
And do you recall that you were under oath at that time?
I was.
And you just testified that you did not question Jerry Young on the night of September 10th, 2012. Is that still your testimony?
That is correct.
All right. Your Honor, may I first witness?
Yes.
Officer Sliviak, I'm showing you a record of the previous testimony.
Yes, may I see it?
Yes, give me 1 second. can you read starting right here where he said he denied?
Young is, let's see, from where are you wanting me to start?
Right over here, he denied.
He denied any connection with Mitchell, Brooke Thompson, or Leslie Thompson Mitchell. It doesn't say anywhere that I questioned him on the night of the murder. Nor did I say it at that time.
Thank you. But according to your testimony, so you did speak with Jerry Young, did you?
I did, but it was not on the night of the murder.
All right. And when you spoke to Jerry Young, you couldn't account for his whereabouts on that night.
No, I could not.
Officer Sliviak, on direct examination, you testified that you confiscated a gun from Joe, didn't you?
I'm not sure if confiscated is the correct word. He handed me the gun.
All right. And there weren't any bullets in Joe's gun, were there?
No, I broke it open. The chamber of the gun was completely empty.
And Joe voluntarily handed the gun to you, right?
That is correct.
And he told you that he had nothing to hide, didn't he?
Like I said, he repeated that phrase throughout the night.
And if Joe had something to hide, he wouldn't voluntarily hand the gun to you, would he?
Again, I don't know what...
Objection, Your Honor, that calls for speculation as well.
I'm going to sustain the objection.
All right. Officer Sliviak, once you arrested Joe, or actually, on direct examination, you testified that the police station performed a paraffin test on Joe's hands.
That's correct.
And you testified that the paraffin test was inconclusive. Is that still your testimony?
No, I didn't testify it was inconclusive. I testified that it was negative.
I'm sorry, that's what I meant. Let's see. And on direct examination, you also testified that there are a number of ways to make that test come out negative, such as using some type of chemical agent to clean your hands, wearing gloves, or even using urine or tobacco. Is that still your testimony?
That is.
All right. And you didn't find gloves, you didn't find any urine, tobacco, or any other type of chemical agents in Joe's room, did you?
I wasn't looking for them at that time.
But you didn't find them, right?
No, because I wasn't looking for them.
Thank you. And you also submitted Joe's gun and the bullet you found at the scene of the to the lab for analysis, didn't you?
That is correct.
But the analysis or the ballistics test came out inconclusive, wasn't it?
The bullet was too damaged to match back to the particular gun.
But it was inconclusive, right?
It wasn't able to be matched to the gun in particular.
But obviously, the ballistics test says that it was inconclusive.
If that's what the ballistic test says, like I said, what I remember is that the bullet was not able to be matched to that particular gun.
All right. And by inconclusive, that would mean that it cannot be concluded that the bullet you found came from Joe's gun.
That's
right?
what I just testified to. We could not match the bullet to the gun.
Thank you. So it's true that Joe actually didn't have anything to hide. Is that true?
Objection, Your Honor, that too calls for speculation.
Oh, I'll allow the question.
In my experience, he had a weapon that matched. He had that fired the same type of bullets that killed Leslie Thompson Mitchell. He wore a dark colored jacket that was described as being the same type, or that was soaking wet, that had been out in the rain. He drove the same type of car. It is very possible that, yes, he did in fact have quite a bit tied.
So, the ballistics test was inconclusive.
That is correct.
Were the tests positive, that would mean something, right?
It would mean that the bullet could have been matched to that particular gun, but again, this bullet hit a door frame and was smashed beyond recognition.
All right. But because the ballistics test was inconclusive, that doesn't mean anything, does it?
It means that I couldn't match the bullet to that particular gun.
All right. No further questions, Your Honor.
No, you're right, we're running out of time. May the witness be excused?
She may.
State have any more proof?
That concludes the state's case.
State rests. All right.
I was gonna make a motion.
Well,
Motion to break.
yeah, we'll take a break.